I understand that in a recent survey that the Manpower Group did, that there is a severe talent shortage across the world, and that amongst the top countries witnessing that, India is one of them as well.
Indeed.
I'd like for you to give us a broad overview of where and how you see this unfolding.
Well, it's been very interesting to see how the labor markets have recovered after the pandemic, or still during the pandemic, because it's still ongoing. And by and large, the health of labor markets is back to where it was at pre-pandemic levels. But due to the pandemic, parts of the workforce are not back yet and fully participating. So the supply of workforce is constrained in many markets. And the survey that we did as Manpower Group really illustrates that point, because most labor markets globally have very high shortages of talent. So some of that I think we can attribute to the effect of the pandemic,
Mhm.
and some of it we can attribute to the long-term structural trends, which is related to the demographic evolution, the birth rates, and new workers coming into the workforce, which has been declining over the last decades and is continuing to decline going forward as well. So it's a mix between a pandemic related impact as well as a structural trend that is continuing and will continue into the future as well.
Are we witnessing these talent shortages in specific industries and specific skill sets, or would you say that they're fairly broad?
I would say that they're fairly broad, but at this stage of the pandemic, in many countries, so all of the things that we couldn't do as consumers, where people eventually had to leave their workplaces because their businesses weren't operating due to lockdowns, that's where you're seeing the toughest time attracting talent back, because they've either moved on to different industries, or
Okay.
they're still not certain that this recovery is truly lasting. So they're still waiting to get back into their former employment and their former industry. But we think that over time, this anomaly generated by the pandemic will subside and things will start to normalize, but normalize towards still a very tight labor market in almost all countries across the world.
If they're moving to newer industries, does that mean the demand for job in newer industries is increased by as much, which is attracting talent from conventional industries, some of the services industries that were the worst hit in the pandemic? Can you explain what this balance is or how it's working out to be?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between, the structure evolution, which is, moving away from manufacturing and into a services-based economy in many countries, and distinguish that from the events that happened during the pandemic, which were extreme and unusual.
Hmm.
So it also has a lot to do with how countries reacted during the lockdown phases. In Europe, employment relationships were maintained and governments paid companies to maintain the employment. In the US, governments sent money to the individual, and that meant the employment relationship was ruptured, which means a lot of people changed industries. So they then gravitated towards industries that they felt were less cyclical and or less impacted by the pandemic. But by and large, we don't think that this indicates a trend of shift between industries. We still think that this is dealing with pent up demand for products and services, and that's what's attracting this upsurge in demand. Over time, we would expect that to subside and normalize to a general level of demand that is commensurate with the economic growth that any particular country is experiencing.
You also attributed this to some long term structural changes in demography, for instance. Uh, do you believe because of that, some of these shortages will become endemic to certain industries, and those industries will struggle to find the kind of talent that they need, especially, let's say, maybe in the lower income worker groups or the blue collar worker groups? Or do you think maybe the shortages will become endemic in any other group?
I think that during the pandemic, we got a glimpse into the future
Mhm.
of work as it relates to the acceleration of these structural trends. What's it like when demographic means there's less workers available in the market? What's it like when technology is accelerating rapidly and we have to work and collaborate in very different ways that we were used to? What's it like when individuals make choices not only based on compensation, but on their aspirations, looking for companies that represent their values, other benefits, and finally, looking at how companies react to this environment and how they think about their supply chain in different ways. So it gave us an opportunity to look into the future. I think that once we get over this pandemic caused disruption, you will have some aspects of structural trends that are the same as they were before, but you will also have some new ones. And above all, we believe that the lasting legacy of the pandemic is going to be an increased expectation for the individual for more flexibility.
Okay. Besides that, are there any other kinds of challenges you see these trends throw up? I do know in some of the conversations you've been having, not here in just in Davos, but otherwise as well, you expect reskilling to be a big challenge that employers face across the world to be able to adapt or mitigate some of these trends.
No, I think that's a very good point because the workforce is generally bifurcated between haves and have nots in terms of skill sets. Those with the right skills have plenty of opportunities. Those that don't have the skills that employers are looking for, they will be subject to changes. And we think that the defining challenge of our time will be to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of skill and engage in massive reskilling and upskilling initiatives at a country level. Most employers are actively engaged today more than ever before at reskilling and upskilling their employees. Many employers in India have this as one of the hallmarks of their employment and how they attract new employees. Many companies across the world use exactly the same way to build, the skills for the people that work for them. But I think we will need to think about a massive investment in reskilling and upskilling so that we can bridge this gap that otherwise could threaten us with polarization of the workforce, which ultimately ends up being a polarized society.
If you'd like to leave us with a thought on the future of work, we've discussed many issues, so I'll leave it up to you to wrap this up and summarize what you think the future of work will be over the next year or two, at least.
I think we've really seen interesting evolutions and quite positive evolutions. We've rebalanced a little bit of the power between employers and employees, boosted by this pandemic, this unfortunate pandemic. And if you go back historically and look at what's happened with other major disruptive events, many times for workers, it has actually worked out to improve their working conditions, their pay rates. And I would estimate that also in the aftermath of the pandemic, that we will feel that the labor markets are stronger and better for more people than they were before the pandemic.